Hello and welcome to Rock the Talk for Teens. So I don't know if you've watched the previous two recordings. We have been talking about how to have conversations about sexual health and safety with our kiddos. So we started off talking about 2 to 5 years old, the conversations we need to have with them about drawing boundaries, about keeping them safe from unsafe people. And then we went into grade school and about some of the risks and awareness that we need to bring up for that age. And now we've moved on that we're going to talk about our teens. And you'd think it would be getting easier as we move up, but sometimes the conversations get more difficult because our kids really do have a different worldview than us. Teens do talk back. Teens are exposed to a lot of things that maybe we don't want them to be exposed to, but they are. So we have to get real with some of those conversations. We also have to check some of our own bias and our own judgments so that we can have honest communication and really listen to the needs of our children as well, while still preparing them for the world and still warning them of potential dangers and still making sure that by law that they are safe and protected and that they respect other people as well. So what I'm going to do, if you followed along with the previous presentations, you'll know that I show my screen and then you're able to follow along. So if you're more of a visual learner, it's easier for you to see what I'm saying to you. Also, if you go back and view those previous ones, you can make sure that you have a lot of those safeties and those boundaries put in place for your kids. That way you can build off of those previous conversations. If you don't have teen yet, that's okay too. You can start mentally preparing yourself for some of these conversations. A lot of times when something happens in our kids' lives, we overreact, underreact, aren't sure how to react. And so we want to educate ourselves as parents, and we also want to be able to provide appropriate education for our teens as well. So let's get started. So I promise you, I'm not going to go into a bunch of brain development stuff, but our children's frontal lobes have not developed yet. So that means their impulse control and their judgment and their emotional intelligence or control are still making connections. So they don't always know the consequences for their actions. So as much as they're growing up, and sometimes they might be, my teen is bigger than me now. So as much as they might look grown up, they are still developing and they are not fully capable of protecting ourselves. And that's where we come in. And that's why these conversations are so, so important. So teens can still be very naive about power imbalances, right? They might think that they have more power and control over something that they don't, especially within relationships. That's why we have statutory rape laws that do exist, because they don't always recognize that as much as they think that they're in love, they believe that the relationship is mutual, that they do not have power in that relationship. So it's not necessarily a reflection of how mature they are. It's inappropriate on that abuser's part, especially if they're in the mentor over a role of a mentor or an authority figure. Okay, so it's really important that we have some of these conversations with our kids to prepare them, but also to prepare ourselves to look out for warning signs and to be able to have that open communication so that we all understand the risks that are out there. So some of the things we're going to talk about today, we will talk about online safety. Probably all of your teens have a device. All of your teens have a lot more access than even what we used to let them have when they were littler. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk and define and understand consent and what that sounds like. We are going to understand sex as an action, not just an action, I should say, but as a relationship. Okay, we're going to talk about sexual abuse or sexual assault as a crime, sexting and how that falls under that law, as well as child pornography and sex trafficking. Okay, not as scary as the title page look, I promise. So online safety. We have a lot easier of a time talking about stranger danger, maybe even talking about exploitation. Being able to put it, oh, this happens to some kids, right? The real danger happens right in our own homes, a lot of times right in our kids' hands. So 1 out of 5 report that they've received sexual solicitation online. Okay, so our kids have unlimited access right now to the internet and very little supervision, most likely, especially in those teen years. So it's really important that we are talking about inappropriate images, we're talking about messaging and private communication with others, and also we're putting up some safeguards. Okay. I did throw up a couple how to reduce online risk in your home. So I'll give you a second to look through this, and I'm just going to pick out a couple. It is important to reduce online risk. How you choose to do this in your home, though, is up to you. Each family runs differently. Each home runs differently. Each of our kids is different, right? But just maybe leaving devices in common areas, not in bedrooms or bathrooms. Being really careful about the filters that we have for especially images or language, making sure we know what social networks our kids are on. Do they have TikTok? Do they have Instagram? Do they have Snapchat? If they do they understand how to use these? Do we understand how they're using these and some of the things that are on there? Also, just reminding, I know for my home, the phones are allowed for checks. That is part of our privacy policy, but whatever you feel comfortable with at home. Also talking about sexy photos, right? Talking to your kids, what does that mean to you? It surprises a lot of parents, but kids aren't afraid to be asked for that. They're actually a lot of times flattered. So being able to get yourself in that same mind frame that your kid is in, to be able to say, okay, so if they're feeling flattered by this, how do I address this conversation now? Because it's not something they're scared of. It's something we need to have an open conversation about. What are you getting when you send those images? What are some of the risks? Who are you sending them to? Why do you think they want them? All of that conversation, and that opens up a completely new door of conversation to be having with them. Okay, that leads us on to pornography. Yes, we're going to talk about it. I know that a lot of times it's uncomfortable. And I usually, when I'm in public or in person talking about this to people, either their eyes glaze over like, oh goodness, I'm uncomfortable, or their eyes start darting. But I have you here on the computer, so you don't get to run away. We are going to talk about it because it suggests in studies that boys, almost every boy, has been exposed to online porn, 2 to 3 girls. Most often, boys seek it out. More often, girls seem to be exposed to it involuntarily. Does that matter? Not for this conversation necessarily, other than the reasons why they're viewing it, right? When you actually open up to have those conversations with them. So early sexual acts and images are influencing our young people's fundamental understanding of sexuality, of beliefs about sex and relationships, about sexual images and what they mean to us and our society. And it all becomes part of their development, right? They really are learning from pornography, okay? Because this is a reality, and as much as we want to say not our kid though, it's a pretty big reality. We as parents need to have some porn literacy, okay? We have to understand the benefits our kids are trying to get from it. We have to understand the harms and how to have open, honest conversation. And if we're uncomfortable about it or feel shame around it, our kids are going to be uncomfortable and feel some shame around it. So it's important that we learn to be really open and honest with our communication skills and our own beliefs and biases, because we need to figure out sometimes when we're having this conversation, let's pretend we viewed pornography as wrong. Is it because we're worried about the people who are in them? Are we worried because we just don't want our kids having or thinking or being sexual? Or is it because we disagree with masturbation, right? There's 3 different opinions right there. So we have to get real and check ourselves and see what conversations we need to be having with ourselves before we have them with our kids. So again, realizing our conversation, especially about this, needs to be very non-judgmental so that we can keep our kids safe online from this as well. So if your child has viewed pornography, you catch them viewing pornography, you see it on, what do you call it? Your browser history. There we go. That's the word I'm looking for. How do you talk to them? So these are some of the things you need to explore during conversation with them. First one's consent. So when you viewed that material, did it look like they both agreed to the sexual act? Did one participant coerce the other? Did it seem threatening? Okay. And then no matter what type of pornography they were watching, make sure to let them know that in real life, all sexual acts require consent, whether on acting, pornography they do or don't. Okay. And having some conversation about that consent. We are going to talk about it further down. Okay. Emotions. So what feelings did you experience? What feelings is a person experiencing in a pornography? So, making sure that they understand maybe it was satisfying and maybe they can see that. And so maybe that's why they're watching it. Maybe the person looks scared. So what does that look like? Maybe they felt uncomfortable or maybe they didn't, right? Talking about those emotions and reminding them that all sex should be loving and affectionate and have mutual respect. Next is intimacy. So whatever was going on in that image and the fact it was being recorded and shared shows that there wasn't that intimacy. So shared healthy sexuality is an expression is deeply private and intimate between two partners, whether they're in a romantic relationship, whether they are dating or not. Real sex is not porn sex, right? So making sure your kids understand that line. Next is arousal. So sexual images can naturally cause automatic instinctual reaction. Okay. And a lot of times kids will feel very shamed by this, their body arousing or showing arousal to an image that maybe they intellectually find repulsive, right? Or they don't understand why they would be reacting in that way to that. So discussions about the feelings associated with arousal, especially when watching pornography, will break secrecy, right? Secrecy is not our friend. It's not a friend with our kids. So making sure that we are taking away the shame and the blame and the judgment around it so that we can break that secrecy and the power those images have in our kids' life. Okay. So consent is such a big word. Sexual responsibility is such a big word. And adolescents need to understand that just because they are aroused doesn't make it someone else's job to satisfy that arousal, right? Understanding this does empower our kids. It helps them, it helps them understand the responsibility for their action, respect themselves, respect others, including all decision making, especially sex. Okay. So this is actually one of the favorite parts of my job is teaching teens about consent and what that means to them. So regardless about our values about sex and relationships, it is important that we tell our kids that how important consent is regarding intimate activity with their peers, right? So that's hugging, kissing, or sex. No means no, always non-negotiable. No one should feel guilty for saying no, and no one should feel pressured to say yes. So consent is not just the absence of the word no, it's asking and hearing the other person say yes. So the best practice is to ask and receive confirmation that a person wants to do something or continue doing something, especially if they're out at a party, doing things like that. So when you're teaching your kids best practice of consent, it is actually getting an audio, yes, I would like to continue, or I'd like to participate. So the way that I teach teens is through the acronym FRIES. Easy to remember and just a really easy way to explain it to them. And so FRIES means, or consent means, freely given. That means you don't feel pressured. You don't feel like you got tricked into it. You don't feel like they just wouldn't stop asking. You want to keep going. It's reversible. That means you can be sitting naked on a bed and you can still change your mind. It means that just because you did something yesterday does not mean you need to do it again today. It's informed. That means you understand the consequences and the benefits of that behavior. It means you understand how to stay safe doing that sexual act or activity. You understand your rights, right? And you understand the laws around consent and the laws around sexual activity. So it's our job as parents to really start that conversation and give them that information that they need. Because if they aren't seeking it from us, they are getting it from someone else. They are definitely getting information from their peers online, and it's not always accurate. And as much as we might have lived our life through trial and error, we want to at least educate and provide as much information around sexual health and safety for our kids as possible, because the access out there is a lot different than maybe when we were growing up as well. Hey, it also needs to be enthusiastic. So I'm always like, heck yes, I want to keep going, right? You shouldn't hum and haw. You shouldn't be afraid or feel embarrassed. It should be something you really, truly want to do. And it needs to be specific. So specific means that specific act. Each act requires new consent. Each day requires new consent. Just because you're in a relationship does not mean you've given permanent consent. And it's really important our kids know this, and we as adults know this, because a lot of people don't. Okay? Consent is an ongoing conversation every single time. Okay. So we all probably have our own belief systems about what healthy, productive, happy relationships are. Okay. It's important we talk openly with our children about the appropriate role of sex in relationships that we have with others. It's important that our kids do know. And so again, I always leave this up to you have your own values as a family, as a parent, but some really basic things we can make sure we are telling our teens is people are not objects. Relationships should be equal, respectful, and have loving sex. Children receive messages that sex and love aren't related, that sex doesn't affect emotion, that it's easy to have sex without any strings attached. Movies, media, pornography inflate this belief system, and it doesn't mirror real life. Real life, sex involves emotions. Sex makes feelings happen. Sex can be embarrassing. Sex can have a lot of different effects on our life. And then it's important that we talk about sex as a relationship, not just an action. Even if we aren't dating the person, it is still initiating a relationship, and we are going to still have some emotions. It's very rare that you can say no strings attached. Okay. Now talking about sexual abuse as a crime. So it's really important that we understand some laws. And it's really important we teach our children as well, because a lot of times we can get ourselves in situations and we need our kids to understand potential consequences of not having respect, of not having empathy or self-control, of not obtaining consent or responsible sexual behavior, right? We assume that our kids know right from wrong. They know that they should or shouldn't do something. Let's make sure. Let's just tell them the actual laws. Let's remind them of the actual laws, and let's teach them so we can make sure that they truly understand what their responsibility is in a law system, right? So, laws of consent. Under the age of 12, no one can consent to sexual activity. Anything under the age of 12 is sexual assault. No, every circumstance. Ages 12 to 13 years old, you can have sexual activity with someone who is 2 years less a day older, okay? The only time that that would be void is if that person had trust, a position or a relationship of trust, authority, or dependency, okay? Or any type of exploitation, obviously, too. But it's really important to remember that. So that's a babysitter, that's a youth camp leader, that is maybe if a child is in care and it is a child that lives there, that's whose home it is, right? That's because they're dependent on that home. So those types of things break those laws of consent, okay? 14 and 15-year-olds can have sexual activity with anyone who's 5 years less a day older than them. And again, position of authority or dependency. So that is someone who works at a school or a coach or, again, a caregiver of any sort, okay? That's not sexual activity, that is a criminal offense. Again, exploitation, if anyone's exploiting them, even if they're in that age group, it would be a criminal offense. And then age 16, you can actually consent to sexual activity for anyone that's older than you. Again, unless there is a position of trust and authority. So if it's a teacher, if it's someone that's your boss, that sort of thing. Now, that being said, when we are talking about sexting and sexually explicit photos, 16 is not the age of consent, so we are going to talk about that because by law, that until you're 18 is child pornography. So we are going to talk about that because our kids are very sexually active visually with their phones, with videos, pictures, that sort of thing. So it's important that they understand that just because they can accept consent to sexual activity does not mean they can consent to that. Okay? So when it comes to sexting, much like when I was talking about pornography, we don't want to think our kids are doing it. A huge majority are. Huge majority. So let's just talk about it. Let's talk about how they would feel if those images were shared with their friends. Let's talk about what would happen if the relationship fell apart. So if they're sending that to their boyfriend, their girlfriend, their significant other, what would that look like if that relationship ended and that person had all those photos or those videos? Let's talk about their need to feel attractive with even people they don't know and the potential harms of sending those photos to people. Let's talk about the threat of exploitation. Let's talk about predators. Let's talk about people who pretend to be minors. Let's talk about legal ramifications for creating, receiving, and distributing nude images for themselves and for other people. And let's talk about power and control that those images can have in our life. Open conversation, right? I understand that when you send a photo that you find your body beautiful and someone else does too. You know, how does it make you feel when you send those images? How does it make them feel? What's something else we can do? How do we protect ourselves? How do we draw boundaries? Okay. And some of these questions I'm asking, and I'm not giving you an answer for them. That's a conversation I want you to have, you know, maybe with your partner or with a friend to say, you know, what kind of boundaries can I help my kid draw on this? Or have you ever been through this before? And then with our kids, how are we going to keep you safe? Because these are realities. These are the facts. And I'm not saying whether you're doing it or not, right? We aren't accusing them. It's saying, but if you are, how can we draw boundaries? Or if your friends are, you know, who do you guys have to talk to? Are you informed, right? Okay, so now I said we were going to talk a little bit about child pornography, and I think this is so important because under the age of 18, any sexually explicit conduct involving a minor, which includes photos, videos, digital or computer, any images that are created or adapted, modified, that depict a minor is sexual assault, is child pornography, okay? So what does this mean for parents of teens? That means we need our kids to understand that they can be held accountable for creating, distributing nude images or videos of minors. So that's even if it's to their boyfriend or girlfriend, even if it's of their boyfriend or girlfriend, even if it's a practical joke, even if they were angry, they can be held accountable for their actions. So a lot of times when I'm talking to teens, I say, do you realize how much, you know, I know that you find your girlfriend very attractive, we'll say. And, you know, do you want that potential that you could be breaking the law? Do you want that power in your hand? Because we all make mistakes when we're angry, right? So really getting them to think twice about that distribution of that material, especially when they're angry, when relationships end, that legally speaking, law speaking, they can be held accountable for those actions, okay? Now, I said that maybe this is one of the easiest conversations to have, and it does need to be had because a lot of times we have this myth or stereotype belief that people who are sexually trafficked live on the street, or people who are sexually trafficked, you know, get kidnapped, taken, and held captive against their will. Many people who are being used in human trafficking and sexual trafficking are exploited while they live at home, while they are in contact with their family, while they often still attend school. Traffickers are skilled at manipulating child victims and control them through deception and lies and pure affection, sometimes threats and violence. Again, sometimes with those sexual images. So you sent me this image, I'll show your parents, or I'll show someone. So that fear of not continuing. So we have to talk to our kids about those dangers or about how to recognize those dangers in their friends so that they can get help for them as well. and recognize signs of victimization within our own home. Does our child spend a lot of time on technology? Are they withdrawing? Do they have an influx of money coming in? Are they hanging out with people that you don't know who they are anymore? Be real and talk to your kids about these concerns, not because we want to instill fear, but because we want to educate. And we want to be able to educate with fact-based learning, right? We want our kids getting the proper information that they need. So on to sexual development. So what's normal, what's not normal? I don't know if I can 100% answer that for you, but for teens, they are really defining their sexual development. They are really figuring out what their values are in sex and relationships, and everything's being questioned and tested. And if you're a parent of one of these teens, you probably already know this. But as they're learning to be independent and they want and crave that independence, they also still really do benefit from honest, compassionate, real conversation from caregivers or trusted adults. So we are going to talk about some common behavior is what I'll call it instead, because sometimes we get really concerned or we blow something out of proportion, or we think that maybe our child is acting in a way that we don't think is normal. So we are going to talk about some common things here. So it is common for teens to talk and joke using sexualized terms. It is common for them to date and experiment sexually with peers. It is common for them to masturbate for pleasure. It is common for them to seek out sexualized images or to sext. So if these are common behaviors, that means most likely you're going to have a conversation about them, preferably before they do it, while they're doing it, after, right? It's an ongoing conversation. Sexual health, the sex talk with our kids is an ongoing conversation. It's not, I made a joke, I think, in my first video, I said, it's not you sit them down in the bed and have one talk about birds and bees. It's an ongoing conversation about drawing boundaries, about feelings, about relationships. So we have to be down to earth and listen to what our kids are actually experiencing. Why are they using pornography? Is it because they're trying to explore relationships? Or are they trying to understand sex or how to have sex? Or are they doing it for pleasure, for masturbation, right? Because each way you'd address it differently and you'd be having a little bit different conversation with them. So really talk to them while you're talking to them about all of these things. Make sure you're throwing in about consent and respect in the law, because these are opportunities to have these real conversations that oftentimes our kids are giving us opportunities, but we as parents have to take them. We have to notice them. So some uncommon sexual behavior would be public masturbation, sexual attraction towards much younger children, and I didn't put it on here, but any sexually aggressive or violent behavior as well. So problematic behavior, if it's not appropriately addressed by a qualified therapist, it can lead to an adulthood of sexually inappropriate abuse towards others. So it's really important that we recognize these unhealthy behaviors and we get the support system that our kids need if they are showing any problematic behaviors or more uncommon sexual behaviors. As a final note, there is an untangible and undeniable feeling of sensing when something's off, a person's off, our kids are off, right? Don't suppress or deny your instinct. Embrace it, exercise it, talk to your kids, and talk to your kids about listening to their gut instinct. It's important that they are recognizing when something's off, that they're trusting their own gut instinct when it comes to sex and consent, right? Have honest, non-judgmental conversation with your teens and hear their worldview, right? A conversation or communication is not just talking, it's also listening. So we need to listen to the voice of our teens as well. And through education and communication, we empower our young adults to be responsible and respectful in their relationships. Again, I've included the sexual assault counseling program through SIGN, contact information as well for me at the Sexual Assault Outreach for education. And I hope that you learned a little bit about having conversations with your kids and you feel more empowered to have some conversations that aren't always easy to have. Thanks for tuning in and listening, and I look forward to talking to you again.